Art and healing are both processes, reciprocal and shared. They both, they both are dependent on reflection, connection, and contact. There is a word in Hebrew that means both terror and revelation. The root is or, which means light, and or conjugates to become, to see, to mirror and reflect. And the homonym is female teacher. Art is an array of frequencies of light and color, consciously or unconsciously aligned into form. Form is a vehicle for frequency. Art works much like a laser, often used as a precise medical tool. I was a questioner from earliest childhood. At 6, I was writing essays called Enigma. My family was in dire straits. My mother, who was a renowned poet, also suffered from what's now called borderline personality issues. My father was an invalid, suffering the deterioration of the motor cells of his body. We were relatively poor. The world was involved in Korean War. Every day I could read the news. The news was terrible. And I couldn't understand how we had reached the pinnacle of civilization and we still couldn't deal with love, food, and shelter. At 8, I was reading the Torah in Hebrew and Yiddish. And I asked my Orthodox teacher, how come, although the names of God were both male and female in the Torah, we were only allowed to talk about God as he? And he came down the aisle and he picked me by the hair and threw me out, and I was never allowed back. And this began my feminist stance. And many years later, I made a painting which deals with a female Torah, and inside only the words Kol Isha, which means voice of a woman, because the voice of a woman is not allowed to be heard by a man, because it would distract him from his Torah studies. At 10, I wrote Albert Einstein, and I asked, how could he be the greatest scientist in the world? And as I had read, believed in the God of the Old Testament, who created such terror and misery and hunger and war. And he wrote me back within 2 weeks, and the key line was, try to form your opinions always according to your own judgment. This line remained for me the guide of my life and still is. I just want to check with you. Are you seeing images?
Yes, everything's good.
Okay, good. Thank you. 27 years later, by the way, I was invited to Princeton to give my talk on the origin of alphabet, and I was taken to Einstein's house and the desk upon which he had written me that letter so long ago. I can only give you an idea of what a circle it was for me. From early childhood, nature was my refuge. And while the other kids were playing kickball and talking about the latest in felt poodle skirts, I was in the forest in a very secret lake studying the great books that I had brought with me. The thinkers, the writers, the female pioneers, they became my teachers at a very early age. In Jewish Montreal, where I grew up, the concept of Oriental pretty much was relegated to Chinese food. I knew no Gentiles, and it wasn't until I was 14 in New York that I finally saw people of color and ethnicities, and I knew this was where I wanted to be. I hoped to grow up to be a writer and psychologist eventually, and accidentally, I became a multi-hatted artist. What we see is what we are as artists. The artist aligns frequencies into form or image and causes psychophysiological change. The artist is a medium between spiritual and material worlds who uses a medium to layer veils of light and shadow to produce illusions. Scientists gather changing information from material and intellectual worlds to explain the presence of substance by measuring illusions. Artists and shamans transform by conjuring. The artist transfigures the medium into form in order to alter states of mind and body of both the artist and the viewer. The shaman or lama or priest or healer invokes altered states of the mind and body through visual oral performance. Ritual is key to all and may be either private or public. The artist brings abstraction into form, and the scientist brings form into abstraction. We are complementary to each other. I began painting in '68, layering planes of light and space over each other. And after a year, I set up what I called a still life. These were ordinary, everyday cooking materials, but as I saw them, they began to have a metaphor. I was beginning to think of them as the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt walking across the desert. And the concept of metaphor became really important for me. At this point, I want to introduce to you a theory called apophenia, which is the tendency to mistakenly perceive connections and meaning between unrelated things. This was generated by a psychiatrist in the middle of the 50s, saying that this is the beginning stages of schizophrenia. I really counter this profoundly because if anything is the heart of creativity, it has to do with the ability to see many variations on what is there and what may be there. That is truly where the creative process begins. So I was coming up in graduate school, 60s, 70s in Berkeley and Los Angeles, and the zeitgeist at the time was the conflation of Eastern philosophy, quantum physics, Gestalt psychology, mind-expanding drugs, the women's movement, Black liberation, Vietnam War. It was a fomenting time of ideas and action. And in '71, I became one of the founders of the first feminist art organization in the world, LA Council of Women Artists. And I used the domestic food items as metaphors to symbolize the plight of the female being trapped by her biology, the eggs, and her great big personality and capability not being able to be fully shown. Or in this as house arrest, 6 foot, fried eggs being the prison. As an art historian, I was well aware of the medieval paintings of the Virgin with the putti, the little angels on top. I translated it into my own imagery. And I began to put different ideas and associations and memories into the same work. I imagined that there were different thicknesses of glass placed over ordinary foodstuffs, and this caused me to see things differently at different moments. And I also thought, well, I could paint a whole batch of illusions of reality. That meant that I could hold a whole lot of truths in my head at the same time. I could also imagine truths within truths within truths and began to wonder, is there a single truth? For example, here I could paint tremendously huge and substantial images and as easily refute them by imagining them peeling off each other. I knew that I was using the canvas plane as a way to look into my own personality. In '74, I took my first solo voyage into the mountains, the Sierra Mountains, and I had a van at the time. The van got stuck in a blizzard. It would not move. I was in an isolated place. The second day I began to walk. I knew this was not a good idea, but I would freeze in the van. 2 days later, I was miraculously found under a snowbank, just about dead. This experience needed a new form of inquiry. And instead of a rectangular form, I needed a circle. The first one was an image that came from a dream. I thought of myself as standing in front of a wash basin in Fresno, where I never was, and pulling a tapeworm out of the left thumb palm. This was both fascinating and disgusting. And I didn't want to continue doing this. And the door opened and the cleaning person walked in and I asked her if she could help me with this task. And she said, oh no, this is something you must do on your own. So I knew I had more exploration to do. The tapeworm became the serpent. This is the only animal that can be underground, on the ground, in the air, and in water, and is traditionally and hermeneutically the searching animal. I understood the complexity of relationships as all of these ribbons got caught in each other, entangled, and only occasionally a little area of respite. But as the ribbons became free, I imagined that there's more yet for me to discover. And so I started another series looking at myself as an orange egg with my name in Hebrew defined by my attachments. And I looked into my head, my brain, and using the first letters of the Hebrew words for air, fire, and water, I wove them together to find my place as Earth in this complex universe. And these 3 white spheres appeared mysteriously. And I looked into my brain with my right eye and began to think I could see my names inscribed in pomegranate seeds in Hebrew. And I looked deeper into the core and looked at DNA, and I understood that anywhere there was vitality, there had to be a relationship of at least 2. And that a third, a witness, had to be there to perceive this duality. When I painted reflections of events in time, I understood that anywhere there was a crossing of DNA was the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is the source, the origin, the beginning of all things, much like DNA. Excuse me. I found a wedding between mysticism and science. Yeah. I began to see through tissue and through marrow. And in 1980, I became paralyzed on my left side. And I had 2 canvases built in my size. They were 5.5 feet tall, and I had myself penciled in facing forward. And I worked within my body for about a year and found that the entanglement ultimately disappeared and I was well. And the second of these 2 canvases, I painted over a full-length self-portrait, the regeneration of the spirit. I learned to trust intuition as it is found and expressed in body-related imagery. The image seemed to go underwater, and even underwater, it seemed to be creating images that entranced me, like the word for woman that has the words for man, woman, God, and life in it. And soon it became evident that I was to step out of the watery underwater place where I'd found myself in my imagination and step directly into a pond, an actual pond in Southern California, where I spent 3 years with that pond, painting it in different times of day and night, different seasons, and really understanding that here too was another source. I was very fascinated by the breaking of the reeds at the opposite side of the pond. And it seemed to me that there was a sort of a scriptural message that was being written for me. Some kind of alphabet was being shown to me. But the longer I spent at the pond, the more I became interested in the reflection rather than that which was reflected. Again, I became intrigued with the nature of reality. Was it the stick or the reflection or the floating leaves? I could see heaven and earth deep in the pond, and the surface was only reified by the floating leaves, much like human behavior reifies the relationship between humans. I began to look at the land with the same kind of scrutiny as I had looked at the pond, and high in the mountains of Banff, I took the fork in the road, and the hand of nature took me by the hand and led me to various isolated incidents in light. Like this isolated shoot, a green shoot in the middle of a dark place in a forest, much like we humans will find a moment of respite even in our darkest times. Or being naked as this tree was stripped of bark by an elk. Sexual attraction, birth, heartbreak, grief, contact, aging together, allegory of marriage. In the wind, they bend as one. Dignity, the spirit in the tree, and learning to fly in the forest. Was this apophenia or creativity? I knew that form evokes feeling. Feeling conjures metaphor, and metaphor demands expression. I began to photograph areas of land which had the same kind of forms that I had seen at the pond. And I began to find these patterns everywhere in the world. Even symbols like the tree of life and that which denotes affection. Human, gender, animals, and that which is seen as supernatural. I began to find shapes that reminded me of letter forms. And pictograms, like roof over person, the letter A. I began to walk around with this chart of ancient alphabets, and this was the earliest of all alphabets, variously called Old Hebrew, Ancient Semitic, Old Phoenician. And the shapes that I was photographing were in the leftmost column, which are now being seen as 3,500 years ago and as far back as 15,000 years ago. There recently was a PBS special on the origin of alphabet that now pushed the date way back. And I was photographing these forms, and I noticed that they kept reappearing in different forms in the various permutations. I made a book of all the letters and all their permutations over time. And every permutation of every iteration of every letter. I looked into Kabbalah, knowing that this was a visualization and meditation on the form of every letter of the Hebrew alphabet, alone or in combination, that changes not only the psychophysiology of the practitioner, but is also believed to change the nature of cosmology in the moment. I began to see words. Even the word for letter, high in the Rocky Mountains of Banff, made of the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and the last, Taf, roots on the ground in front of me. You can imagine how excited that made me. And I was entranced by the fact that the last form of the first letter, Aleph, is the same as the first form of the last letter, Taf. Is this not the cyclic repetition of DNA as photographed by Franklin in 1952? What if it were true that nature speaks in signs and that the secret to understanding its language consists in noticing similarity in shape? Look at the form, Narby wrote. And I was perplexed. Why was it that all alphabets universally were based on the same 5 forms that I was finding? And one day I got it. I had my eureka moment that which was reflecting the form was the same as the form reflecting. As our ancestors ubiquitously searched for food or foe, certain forms leaped out at them, those reflecting the hardwired neurons and neural processes of perception and cognition. Reciprocal relationship between observer and observed, perceiver and perceived. Each is changed by the other. By 1981, I had collected enough information and images worldwide that I came up with this idea, which I called cosmography, the writing of the universe. And I was invited to present it for the first time at a conference of 100 scientists. And my idea was accepted by the scientists, much to my gratitude and amazement. And then I was invited worldwide to present my idea, and I traveled with 4 slide projectors, and it was terribly cumbersome. And so eventually I made a movie following the discovery process. And then a couple of years ago, I released a second movie that had been requested of me to make for kids of all ages, extrapolating the idea. And I went to 25 different countries and cultures and looked at their alphabets and saw how these 5 forms were present in their landscape as well. So universally, this was the accepted 5 forms. Recognition of and by familiar form is a reflective process, life affirming. I began to ask, do we see because of how we think, or do we think because of how we see? We universally recognize external forms in the same way because they reflect our hardwired perceptual apparatus, but we give meaning to form in cultural context. I spent 86 and 87 in 15 Asian countries. My childhood idea of Oriental was demystified, and I was indulged in alphabets and languages, cultures and medicine and shamanism. The medication of the West became the meditation of the East. I learned that belief systems are random, contextual, and convenient, and joy is culturally determined, while grief is experienced universally in the same way. Joy is culturally determined, such as one culture wants many husbands, another wants many wives, one wants sons, another wants daughters. Sexual preference is up for grabs depending on the culture, and God's changed every 5 kilometers. But grief is experienced universally by loss of contact, rejection, and abandonment. While cultures vary widely, we are fundamentally more alike than we are different. In the East, secular is sacred. Positive, conscious, interactive seeing brings you form that changes psychophysiology. In the West, the power of imagery is only understood as pornography. In the East, sex is the marriage of wisdom and compassion. And healing is accommodated through mandalas, such as this Tibetan mandala toward integration, or the deity of healing. And in other early cultures, images are used for healing as well, such as this Navajo sand painting and ritual dance of Bali and Bhutan and African tribes. Seeing someone who is meaningful to you will also cause a psychophysiological change. Seeing something that you determine as beautiful will also cause a psychophysiological change. As does architecture in the shape of bodies will cause a sense of comfort and well-being. I spent 16 months alone in a high mountain forest in northern Arizona, 900 feet. I left all the comforts of home and assumed my deer mentality. 2 of my last names mean deer, Yellen in Polish and Hirsch in German. I lived with the big animals. The forest became my cathedral. I read the landscape of the trees. I was very much alone. And when the greatest forest fire ran through Tonto National Forest, the chiggers found the liquid in my eyes. I became blind for a while. And in the winter, the temperature went down, sometimes to 20 below. And I moved into this little shack and I put visqueen on the windows to keep the wind out at least. I had to collect snow for water because the water pipes had frozen and burst through the floor. A baby bobcat adopted me and slept in my hair. He grew so large, he kept falling off the bed, but he kept trying anyway. And I never fed him. In the day, he went out to hunt, and he came back every night. My paintings descended deeply into the unconscious, the subconscious, all the different consciousness put together. I was becoming one with nature. In the winter, I walked with bears. I learned from the herding animals that we too are herding animals, as it's only within our herd that we can be heard. After 9 or 10 months, I felt that I was tabula rasa, that I was a shadow of the reflection of the substance. I felt that I could die. I had reached my goal. And I dreamed that I was flying over myself as I lay on the bed waiting to die. And the man who had miraculously found me when I had frozen nearly to death that many years ago appeared in my dream, and he said to me, "You must get through this one in the snow too, Gila." I woke up and all of the hardship of living disappeared. Life was a gift. I clearly had greater intention to live than to die. A month later, I received an invitation from the Dalai Lama in India to come to the first ever teaching, tantric teaching of any Dalai Lama of compassion. And I left my snow-covered mountain and went to the other snow-covered mountain and sat with 300 monks in the cold as the Dalai Lama instructed us in this tantric teaching of bodhicitta. We were instructed to visualize two types of white spheres. The main white sphere started at the top of the crown chakra, and we visualized it coming down the right side of the body and nourishing all systems and organs and coming back up to the top and out toward to all sentient beings. We were told to have the intention of doing the practice for the sake of the liberation of all beings. And the tantric mystic physiology of the subtle body is directly related to the somatic physiology of regular medicine. The visualization practice nourishes the body, speech, and mind. When you feel better, you are kinder and feel greater compassion to others. You become other-directed, right action. I knew that form, perspective, thought, belief, behavior change psychophysiology. I was reminded again that form evokes feeling and feeling conjures metaphor, and metaphor demands expression. Visualization plus meditation became medication. The T and C between them were the tender care. I had already determined that recognition is proprioceptive, hardwired into physiological systems. Therefore, the paradigmatic model of contact and communication must lie submerged in our deeper recesses. If contact and communication is the glue between both animals and humans, valence attracts and stabilizes chemical combinations, and gravity tethers planets and galaxies. I believe there must be a profoundly embedded paradigmatic reflective model that allows us to perceive positively affective forms. I began to study cell behavior, a discernible unit of life that tends to live in groups, as do animals and humans. Cells whisper together through cell membranes that vibrate in the electromagnetic field called the soliton. But calcium is necessary for the cells to keep whispering. I show you here cells, the soliton, the presence of calcium, and the cells getting together and having a party. But if no calcium is present, they cannot cross the barrier. They begin to clone themselves. which is what we call cancer. Many systems in our body also have reciprocal relationships, like this sympathetic and parasympathetic system. When they're working well, they spoon each other, or they are combined with each other like DNA. In psychology and psychiatry, we also have this. In isolation, we may develop psychopathology. We may mirror ourselves and become narcissists, or physically isolated and talk to ourselves, or create multiple personalities when we're emotionally isolated. Much like our hardwired physiological systems, our search from birth is for a resonating, symmetrical reflection, not a clone. All requires reflection in order to live. From infancy, we model behavior with mirror neurons, with reflection, connection, and contact. We are looking for exactly similar, but not identical. We look for congruency, much like two hands clasped, but not held up in front of each other. We look for harmonious difference to incite healthy growth. The well-intentioned stimulation animates emotional and creative life. So back to those white spheres. In 1992 to 97, I created another series called Temple of Mind, and these white spheres appeared. I didn't know where they came from, but I always follow the image. Were they other worlds? Were they calcium? Were they bodhicitta? And then I started another series in 97, the first of which I called Equipoise. These were in the shape of diamonds. And the white spheres continued. And in 99, June 29th, I had a horrible accident on Queen Charlotte Island, which is the home of the Haida and Kwakiutl Indians for 15,000 years. It's 200 miles west of British Columbia. And I was there on a research project related to Emily Carr, who was very much an influence on me throughout my life. I was found hanging in a crushed up car, a crushed up body, by two Haida EMTs who were called, and this must have been about 4 hours after the accident. I was actually found at the bottom of the ravine because the person who had preceded me on this remote road happened to be a nurse who was vigilant by profession, and she had seen a white car, and then she didn't see the white car, and she came back and she saw this crumpled up car at the bottom of the ravine. And she drove for 3 hours to the infirmary on the island that had no equipment, not even an X-ray machine. And that's when the two Haidas came and found me at the bottom of the ravine. I woke up into consciousness and immediately began visualizing blue ice through my body. I knew that I was very badly injured. They gave me morphine to go and took me to that infirmary and kept me on morphine for 5 days. On the 5th day, I decided I had to leave, and on morphine to go, I managed to get to a ferry on that island and to a prop jet on another island, and to Vancouver, and then to LA, and then to St. John's Hospital, and walked barely to my doctor's office. And he immediately took me to the MRI. And I found then that I had broken 3 vertebrae, most ribs, sternum, scapula on both sides, injured hands, knees, head, heart. EKG was moribund, 5 millimeters of bone fragments in my spinal column. I was in very bad shape, but I had no surgery, and I was home in a Velcro body cast for 2 months, studying medical texts and reconstructing all of the injured areas of my body from the inside out, visualization. I learned later, because my EKG was always that of a dead person, that the EKG machine was not measuring the heart exactly, it was measuring the peritoneum. So yes, the peritoneum was very badly injured, but my heart clearly was still moving. After 2 months, I began to paint. I was able to walk up to my studio and I had very large 7-foot tall diamond canvases made. And I started to reconstruct my body from the inside out. I worked with the spinal column and with the cells and with the ribs and with the spirit. And I also began to inscribe these paintings in Hebrew. This one is called Who Will Live and Who Will Die. And I knew that the more faculties we use toward healing, the more powerful we are. And then I began to think, well, you know, these white calcium, were they calcium? What were they? Were aligned in a familiar pattern. And so it began to bring to mind the visualization of the tantric teaching and also of acupuncture points and moxibustion points, as well as meridian points and the morphogens in the lymphatic system. I was making what I knew to be medicine paintings as I was gaining strength throughout my body. And then I had this piece of wood made in 2 layers so that I could imagine doing open heart surgery, getting to my spinal column, finding those 5 millimeters of fragments and attaching them to the vertebrae. And they disappeared that way. And months later, I was able to imagine holding the power in the middle of my body and strong enough again to look outside toward nature. I imagined that I was using skins of light because the Hebrew word or means both light and skin. And as a painter, this is what we're doing. We're making images out of skins of light. And this was the last of the diamond paintings, is what I called them. And I called it Wind Spirit, Ruach, which means both wind and spirit. And every breath inspires grace in life. The exchange of atoms physically connects all things. Atoms, bodhicitta, calcium, everything is connected to the stardust. By this time, I was very involved in psychoneuroimmunology. I was teaching it to different people, to doctors, doing workshops, people who were ill. And the understanding of mind-body healing was profoundly innate in every cell in my body. The use of biofeedback, visualization, intentionality, mission and purpose, belief, all of which gave me the understanding of why placebos work. And I've collected a great many examples of placebos all over the world and how they work. But what about the white spheres? I recalled that the tantric teachings, I conjectured that when the tantric healing was created, that probably calcium had been combined with bodhicitta at either the conscious or unconscious level. I had already been twice to Tibet, to the Tibetan plateau at 20,000 feet. I knew that the Himalayas are called the baby mountains because they're most recently under the sea, which meant that there's a high mollusk calcium content in the meager vegetation. Tibetans eat only high protein, high calcium diet, yak, meat, cheese, and milk, and are very healthy. And so I sent my conjecture to my friend, the Dalai Lama's biographer, and he then sent it to Geshe Gyaltsen, who is the authority on the origin of practice. And he said, yes, the first of the 2 types of bodhicitta is Buddhahood, consciousness. And the second, with a small b, is that white physical calcium. And these are connected because they're related with elements of the body. And between the 2, they make it possible for the practitioner to go toward great enlightenment in order to benefit all sentient beings. Healing is a process based on acceptance of what is and visualizing what can be. It is a commitment toward integration. Healing is founded in intentionality, grounded in meaning and purpose to help others, facilitated by visualization. Healing art is life-affirming, mirroring optimal form of healthy psychophysiology. Many hospitals here are using positive visualization before, during, and post-op as data reveals greater rate and quality of healing. I always, excuse me, I always remind my students that the first 4 letters of the word paint spells pain, and that we have responsibility as artists to create art that heals. And now we're going to show you art as a healing process in community. I was invited to come to meet the kids of the Sunshine Foundation, and the kids are picked up in their homes, which are usually in very poor situations, and brought somewhere that's really nice, and people are invited to come and sign autographs and talk to them. And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to come, but only if I could work with the kids. And so they got for me a ballroom at the downtown Hilton in LA. And I asked for very specific things. They had to bring a medical skeleton, had to provide medical texts, art supplies, 6-foot paper for every person. I told the kids my story of healing, showed images, and I asked them to stand behind the skeleton, manipulate it, identify their own skeleton in their own body. And every kid was penciled onto paper, facing forward, life-size. And we sat around and we looked at the textbooks, and they identified, named the cancer, their own cancer, and found the healthy body in the textbook. And we're told to imagine it in their own bodies. The kids were then penciled in facing front. They knew the name of the cancer, but they didn't know the location of the cancer prior to seeing the textbooks. They are kept ignorant. The kids are rewarded for being terminally ill. They get to be picked up in limos. They're taken to Disneyland. They meet the president in Washington. They meet famous people. They have no reason to want to get well. Every child was accompanied by a nurse or a therapist. And using the medical texts, every child identified where the cancer was and how the healthy version looked. And here you have kids looking at medical texts, the ones that doctors refer to. They were asked to recreate their bodies with healthy organs. So now they had meaning and purpose. The kids were now artists. Artworks were framed and exhibited in a Hollywood gallery. The gala opening celebrated the artists. The works were bought by collectors. I got calls in weeks following this event from therapists and doctors. They were in remission, drug reduction, strong desire to live. They were proactive in their approach to their own healing. They wanted to know their bodies, become allies with their bodies, rather than fighting, blaming their bodies as traitors, helpless in the face of a dire diagnosis. Their energy was no longer battling cancer, but transforming it. They could become the doctor, the artist, the hockey player, the actor, the scientist, the president. And I did a similar workshop in Nairobi at the Aga Khan Hospital in Kenya. There was no skeleton and there were no books, but I brought what I could with me, including a pop-up skeleton. And I brought about 5 to 10 books with me for quite a lot of people to share. Again, they didn't know the name of their cancer. They were told the name of their cancer. We located it for every child, every person in the textbook that was shared. And we also located it for every person in regard to the skeleton. And again, they were charged with recreating their body with healthy organs. First, they penciled each other in on their 6-foot piece of paper. And you can see that art supplies were very limited in Nairobi. And yet they were incredibly enthusiastic. They felt empowered. There was a lot of collaboration, one person helping another, that was apparently unusual for them. The nature of the textbooks that were there were barely illustrated, but every little illustration made a big dent in every person's ability to visualize correctly. Some of these families walked for days to get to the Aga Khan hospital to be part of this. Kevin Odur, who was a famous Kenyan artist, had lost his right arm and was there to help with the kids with his left arm. George Owiti was a biochemist in his late 30s, early 40s, and he had leukemia. And he was very much engaged in the process. I just want to point out where she changes the word believe to be live. So their attitudes were changed with a colorful mind. And George wrote me, and he said that he was doing well, still on medication, though few side effects, which was a big change for him. He was understanding how the medication worked as a biochemist. He borrowed from biofeedback therapy that I told him about. He was determined to overcome the dragon called cancer. And George lived another 5 years, much to the amazement of his doctors. There were more than 30 adults and children, from toddlers to elderly, including staff, some of whom were cancer-free, who wanted to work. I added adornment, writing, and pasting icons around the portraits. What do you love in the world? Make that part of your drawing. The drawings were exhibited in the Aga Khan Hospital. The positive results were both medical and emotional. Body mapping workshops are now proliferating in the hospital. And the proactive approach to one's own healing, taking charge of one's body, became the norm. From earliest childhood, children should be shown images of their bodies. There may be a shy movie about puberty, but that's all that's officially given. Once they know how things work and that they have power over their bodies, they may not punch each other, perhaps curb war. Our bodies remain the biggest secret for most of us during most of our lives. This knowledge is reserved for doctors and shamans. Here's another example of how art has been used in a healing way. 9 of the women in this picture have been raped. And I started this program called Stepping into the Light. The women were from the area around my university, which is in one of the hardest and most oppressed areas of Los Angeles, South Central LA. The women came to the studio in the art department, and I paired the women with the artists. Each woman was paired with a different artist, and they interviewed each other for 2 weeks before artists began portraits. The artists gained empathy and respect for what the women had endured and survived. And the women regained self-esteem, dignity, confidence in the beauty of their bodies and their souls. The paintings were first exhibited in Carson, California, where the university is, then flown to China and exhibited there. The word rape is not allowed to be said publicly. The program Stepping into Light created workshops which continued underground in China. And here in the US, there's an organization called A Window Between Worlds, where more than 500 shelters across the US for abused women and children are conducted with therapy that is based in art and visualization. And now healing the hospital. I was at a party in Beverly Hills for physicians and psychiatrists, and I just asked, what's the worst hospital in LA? And all said immediately, it's the Watts Health Center. And you may have heard of Watts, which was where the Watts riots, now called Rebellion, took place. And it is an area that is in socioeconomic dire straits all the time, South Central LA. So I went to the Watts Health Center, and it indeed was a miserable place, and doctors and patients wouldn't go there. The crime was immense. And I told the director that I was interested in working with my students to create murals to invigorate and enliven the hospital. And he thought I was out of my mind, which I probably was. But I went back and told my students, here's a project that would really be useful to use your art, our art, to create a place to create healing. And they were very enthusiastic, and I got all the materials donated from Home Depot and from Golden Paints, and we began to do the panels in the studio at the university. And people came to visit the murals as they were being created in the art department. And we decided to make them educational as well as beautiful. And the first place that we were working was OBGYN. So the patients who had been there before, but then no longer were coming, had no idea about the physiology of pregnancy. And so we implemented the 9 stages. We also made a point of including fathers as part of a family and grandmothers as part of a family, women scientists, Michelle Obama, families, nuclear families together. All of this was absolutely new for this area. The Watts Health Center doctors who came back, they came back because they were excited about the murals. And they came to visit the murals in construction in the art department. And soon everybody was talking about the murals and everybody wanted art. And so we got these volunteers in the week before Christmas to bring the murals back to the health center and install them so that there would be a Christmas present. And at the same time, we proceeded with the pediatrics mural, and we brought the beach, which was 20 miles away, to Watts. This is the Watts Towers, the famous Watts Towers. And kids who grow up in Watts never get to the beach. They never leave Watts. And so in a sense, we were collapsing their world so that they could imagine themselves in different environments and strive to go there. This was a cute piece of information on Yelp where Levon S. says, this wall is supposed to make you happy when you're, without them feeling that you're, if she says another wall that's supposed to make you feel better about them, that's us, wasting your time. But she noticed it, and that was the important part, noticed it enough to write about it. And she came back for all her appointments. Then radiology became very jealous and they wanted their own murals. So we began to work with radiology in the studio, and we created murals about sports and about imaginary jungles and other places. But we had to make that little office look bigger. So we did what's called trompe-l'oeil. We imagined that the space actually opened up, and this provided a real sense of what a great big radiology waiting room we had there. And they were very pleased and put up all the murals in that very small space. The doctors wanted to continue to work there. The patients wanted to be there, and they brought their kids who were excited about going to the hospital. Much higher rate of healing and community involvement, low crime, and these murals were named by President Obama one of the best of community projects in the US. So creativity and mental illness Um, Here again, this continuum of metaphor, apophenia, schizophrenia. Is it a muse or is it a devil? And so for this purpose, I'm looking at the origin of the word demon, and the Hebrew word demayon is where that word demon comes from, and also the Greek daemon, Greek who is the chthonic spirit who becomes an evil spirit. Hesse names his hero Demian. It's a blessing and a curse, creativity to mental illness. My mother was a renowned writer, poet, author, and celebrity in Canada. The same mother that Lawrence met at the conference that he mentioned yesterday. When she died, she left 70 diaries spanning her life. She would now be called someone who suffered borderline personality disorder, but she was very ill, and only those who were close to her really experienced that severe illness. She writes, in fact, in her diary when she's at the Allen Memorial in 67, how she walked into her baby, her 8-month-old baby, that was me, baby's room, the baby standing in the crib and using the feces of her diaper and making marks on the wall. And she writes how she beat the baby into unconsciousness. The baby didn't cry. And the baby then stopped talking for 4 years. And the first thing that my mother records in her diary about the child beginning to talk was 4 years later, and she's trying to bring the child out. And she says, "I'll be your friend." And the first sentence is, "What's the matter with being a mother?" And so she realized that the child wasn't retarded as people thought, and that the child was taking notes all that time. But in her first diary, she writes at 13 that she has certain moods, and she's seized with a sad melancholy, and she'll get a sudden idea and try to set it down on paper. And it's the first entry where she's aware of both her troubled self and the healing of inspired creativity. Another diary entry at 71, if anything, it has helped me to avoid madness. I believe that divinity is in humanity and spirituality is in behavior, and wisdom is understanding the consequences of our behavior. And with each breath, we're given a choice whether to stay here for a while longer and help do something creative and helpful for the woes and tribulations of our world. Our big brains are always looking for answers, looking for healing. Sorry. We looking for the grail, that elusive wisdom that has plagued humanity and caused us to search from the beginning, yet it is always elusive, almost understandable, comprehensible, but not quite. We're looking for clarity. We build these edifices in order to house the knowledge of the past. We examine everything with microscopes and telescopes, looking for answers. We wait for divine inspiration. And even in the most sacred of books, the Zohar, we find that there is this duality. The word Zohar, which is the main book of Kabbalah, the 3 letters spell the word Zohar, meaning splendor, but the same 3 letters also spell the word Zahir, meaning be careful, pay attention. All knowledge is double-edged. We imagine parallel universes. We imagine multiple universes. We think perhaps in another universe where the answers will be more visible. Or we imagine multiple dimensions or interspecies communication. But we really know in our hearts that we are riding bareback on each other's souls, and that it is in our reflection that we really begin to understand each other. We recognize our strengths and our weaknesses, our vulnerability, and our miracles. And that even in our ancient ancestors, we see ourselves depicted in old caves. And as we face time, we know that we become the archaeology of the future. And we will still be looking for healing and knowledge in light. Thank you.